Behavioural economics on a post-it number 6, loss aversion. I've talked a little bit about loss aversion in previous post-it notes, but because it's quite a prominent part, really, it's played a prominent role in behavioural economics, in the development of behavioural economics, I thought I'd just devote one small, short video entirely to loss aversion. As I think if you've watched the other videos, you'll know that loss aversion is the phenomena that people seem to pay more attention or weight more losing something than gaining that same specific thing. And therefore you can sort of, people seem to be more motivated potentially by losses than they are by gains of the same magnitude. Now, that observation that people care more about losses, that losses loom larger than gains, people care more about losses than gains, it actually has a very long-standing history in economics. Adam Smith, who, at least in the English-speaking world, is often considered to be the founding father of economics. He talks really about loss aversion intuitively. He, in his book that he wrote in sort of mid to late 18th century, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he provides almost a perfect definition of loss aversion. But his were sort of intuitive speculations, really. I mean, they rang true, I suppose, for most people, but he didn't specifically test, I don't think, loss aversion empirically. And that's really been the contribution of modern behavioural economists over the last 50 years or so, that they've identified. I mean, it's controversial. It's still a controversial concept. Some people don't believe that loss aversion really exists. But many behavioural economists believe that they have measured loss aversion empirically over the last few decades. So just to explain very briefly again what loss aversion is in terms of this diagram. If you look at the horizontal axes, I've placed money on the axes there, but really it could be anything that people place value upon. It could be their reputations. You can think about a loss of reputation or one standing with your fellow citizens or peer group or whatever. But I've just used money here because that's, the most frequently talked about domain of loss aversion anyway, so I'll focus upon money here. And then on the vertical axis, we have the value that people place upon money. The origin is the reference point, so anything below the origin is a loss. Anything below the reference point is a loss, and anything above the reference point is a gain. Right? So what we have here is that we have positive value from gains that can be measured from the vertical axes as people gain particular amounts of money. So say, for example, if this was £50, then you draw up to the curve and then you draw across to the vertical line and you get the sort of subjective value that people place upon £50, right? And then as we go below the reference point on the vertical axis, this is the negative value that people experience from losses. So how loss aversion is diagrammatically depicted here is that if you can imagine that people can gain a particular amount of money, say it's X pounds here, which could be anything, it could be £5, £50, whatever, but just say X pounds, then you draw up to the curve in the domain of gains, draw across to the vertical axis, and you get the utility or the value that they place upon X amount of money, right? Now you can think about them losing that same amount of money. They lose X pounds, right? And then you get the negative value or the negative utility by drawing a line across to the curve, drawing again to the vertical axis, and that's the negative utility or the negative value, the disutility that people experience from losing X pounds, right? Now you can see that the distance here, the positive utility of gaining X pounds is much less than the negative utility of losing X pounds. There's basically a kink in the value curve or the utility curve at the origin, right? So it's smooth down, and there's a kink down. It's steeper here in the domain of losses than it is in the domain of gains. And that's a diagrammatic representation of loss aversion. Now, loss aversion, I think I mentioned this in previous post-its as well. If it is at work, it's got potentially very important policy implications. If you are somebody who believes that we should be trying to motivate people's behavior for their behavior change, motivate behavior change in people. So, for example, if you think about there's a line of work where you give people small financial incentives in order to change their behaviours in some ways. It might be to get them to stop smoking, or to go to the gym, or to lose a bit of weight, or to adopt a healthy diet, whatever. It could be anything that people believe we should be motivating people to do in some sense, right? Now, you can either offer, in terms of small financial incentives or disincentives, you can offer small amounts of money for people to change their behaviours. And my reading of that literature is that it's not particularly promising. You can get people to change their behaviours in the short term to some extent, but over the long term, people tend to revert to their pre-existing behaviours. Most people seem to do that. Instead of offering people small amounts of money for changing their behaviours, you can get people to commit money to what's called deposit contracts. Sometimes they're named Ulysses contracts, named after the Greek hero who tied himself to the mast and warned his sailors not to untie him to avoid the temptations of the sirens. Right? Anyway, deposit contracts. So people voluntarily who want to change their behaviour in some way, if they want to adopt a healthier lifestyle in some way, they might commit some money from themselves to a deposit that they only get back, say at the end of a period of time, month, 6 months, whatever, if they have reached their behaviour change targets. So for example, if they were a smoker, they wanted to stop smoking, they could commit amount of money that they would get back if at the end of 6 months they demonstrate that they were still not smoking, for example, right, hypothetically. And that deposit contract is informed by the phenomena of loss aversion. People might be more heavily motivated to avoid the loss of the deposit that they've committed to the contract than they would be to a similarly sized promise of a financial incentive if they were to meet their behaviour change targets. Okay, so that's loss aversion. I hope you get the gist of that. And I will move on, I think, to the reflection effect in the I'm going to move on to the endowment effect, which is related to loss aversion in the next post-it.